Today, we're diving into the story of an object, a truly incredible machine, an engineering marvel that became one of the most infamous symbols of the 20th century. Hitler's Mercedes-Benz 770. And this quote, man, it just nails it, right? It gets right to the heart of what we're talking about. Some objects get so tangled up in history that they stop being just things. They become these controversial relics, trophies of a conquered evil. And that is exactly what happened to this car. But let's back up a bit, because before this car was ever linked to the Third Reich, it was the absolute, undisputed pinnacle of automotive luxury. It was known as the Grosser Mercedes, which literally means the Great Mercedes. Now, you have to understand, Mercedes didn't build this car for you and me. This was for heads of state, for titans of industry. The price was so high they didn't even list it. It was one of those if you have to ask, you can't afford it situations. It was a statement of ultimate power and prestige way before the Nazis ever got their hands on it. The car was actually produced in two different series. The first one, the W07, was already an absolute beast of a machine. But then came the second series, the W150, in 1938. And this was a huge engineering leap forward. A more advanced chassis, independent coil spring suspension, they basically took an already incredible car and made it even more formidable. And just look at the company this car kept. Before its darkest chapter, the 770 was the go-to vehicle for emperors, kings, even Pope Pius XI had one. So this wasn't just some German car. It was a global symbol of power and dignity. Hitler actually started using a 770 pretty early on, back in 1931. But he and the Nazi Party would very quickly transform it from just a vehicle of state into a rolling stage for their propaganda. Suddenly, it wasn't just a car anymore. It was a carefully curated part of the Führer's public image. You look at any of those countless photos and newsreels, and there it is. The car is always there, carrying him through these massive crowds, projecting this image of unstoppable, modern, and honestly terrifying power. And they physically altered the car to serve this new purpose. They built a platform under his seat so he could stand up and look taller than the crowds. They added a special handle to the windshield frame so he could brace himself during parades. And eventually, they turned it into a fortress on wheels, with heavy armor plating, bulletproof glass, and even hidden compartments for machine pistols. And here's where the story gets, well, just plain bizarre. Hitler never actually drove himself, but he was apparently obsessed with his motorcade's safety record. He would lecture his drivers constantly about being cautious. It's such a strange, almost mundane little detail in the life of a man responsible for such unimaginable destruction. So what happens when the war ends? Well, the cars are scattered to the wind. These ultimate symbols of Nazi power are captured by Allied soldiers, they're often misidentified, and they begin this new, very strange life that leads to decades of confusion and mystery. At the end of the war, these priceless symbols of power were treated with absolutely zero ceremony. American and Russian troops just started using them as regular staff cars, running them into the ground. There's no doubt that many of these artifacts, worth millions today, probably just ended up on the scrap heap. All this confusion led to one of the most fascinating cases of mistaken identity I've ever heard of. It involves a car that sat in a Canadian museum for over 35 years, hiding its true, shocking history in plain sight. Okay, so follow this car's incredible journey. It's found by a U.S. sergeant on a train in Austria. It gets shipped to the States and toured around the country billed as Göring's car to help raise war bonds. Then it's sold at a surplus auction for just over $2,000, and eventually it's gifted to the Canadian War Museum. And there it sat until 1980. That's when a researcher scraped away some paint, found the original license plate, and got confirmation from Mercedes-Benz it wasn't Göring's car, it was Hitler's. The allure of these cars, even when they were misidentified, created a total frenzy. Back in 1973, another 770, this one actually belonged to a Finnish marshal, was sold at auction for a record-shattering $153,000. Why? Because everyone believed it was Hitler's car. At the time, that was the most anyone had ever paid for a car at auction. Period. So that brings us to today. The handful of cars that survived now exist in this really murky moral gray area. They're marvels of engineering, they're priceless historical artifacts, but they're also deeply, deeply uncomfortable reminders of a very dark past. Their dark history has created this weird, controversial market. Every now and then one pops up for sale, usually for millions of euros. And then it just disappears again, into some private collection, its story hidden away from public view. This general unease has even led to a collector's myth, the Mercedes curse. The story goes that owning one of Hitler's cars brings you terrible luck. And look, while it's probably just a spooky story, it tells you something about the deep discomfort people feel about possessing an object so closely tied to pure evil. And maybe the most telling part of this whole legacy is the institutional silence. For years, if you went to the official Mercedes-Benz website, its company history would just stop in 1926, and then it would magically pick back up again after the war. It was a way of just completely sidestepping this entire uncomfortable chapter and its most infamous customer. All of this leaves us with a really challenging final question. What is the right thing to do with an object like this? Is it a historical document that we should study, or is it a symbol so toxic it ought to be destroyed? Is there a way to preserve the warning without glorifying the evil?